Welcome back. All right, so one question I commonly get asked in live streams is who is your favorite player on? And very often it's of all time. So I know I did videos on who my all time favorite players were from certain teams, but those were years ago. And so without going through and cheating and grabbing those names again, what I've got on the board here is you'll notice Whalers, you'll notice Thrashers, Nordiques, North Stars. Yeah. Every team that's played while I've been watching, I didn't include the Colorado Rockies because they're only in for a couple of seasons that I watched. So, that being said, I'm going to go through and name off my favorite player from every team. And these might be current guys, might be guys who played 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But let's go ahead and get started. And again, it's in a random order. So we'll start with Pittsburgh. My pick for Pittsburgh. And it's Ron Francis. And that Ron Francis trade back in the early 90s that set the Penguins up to become Stanley Cup champions was absolute brilliance by the Penguins. And Francis was such an excellent forward. And having him and Lemieux on the same team just seems unfair looking back. It feels like that's a very unfair setup for the rest of the National Hockey League. So for me, Ron Francis, who I thought was a very good forward, and just he really gave Pittsburgh exactly what they needed when they were Stanley Cup champions in the early 90s. For Ottawa, there were a couple I considered, but I'm going with Erik Karlsson. Erik Karlsson at his peak was fantastic, and he did have good defense. And I know there's the whole debate about his defensive game, but there have definitely been some seasons where his defense is good enough and his offense is fantastic. And he's been a lot of fun to watch. I think he was a good captain for them. I had no problem with, picking up a Karlsson jersey, even wore it in a video the other day because I still think that when Karlsson's career comes to an end, we'll remember him mostly, I would think, as a Senator. Sure, the way things ended there wasn't pretty, but I mean, he's got company there when it comes to Ottawa and players not having a great exit. Boston. Boston was easy. Cam Neely. Power forward of the 80s and early 90s, and sadly his career wasn't long enough. Glad he's in the Hall of Fame. And 50 goals in 50 games, all that fun stuff. Neely was a lot of fun to watch. And once he was with Adam Oates, you got to see just how strong he could be and consistent with his goal scoring because Oates, I think, was one of the best passers I've ever watched. I'm going to do a video on that, too, I think, over the next week here that'll post while we're on vacation. Colorado, this was relatively easy. One thing with splitting this up so that I've got the Nordiques and the Colorado Avalanche. Joe Sakic goes up there for Colorado, and the Quebec Nordiques get an entry as well. And I will not use the same player twice. One rule I gave myself today for this is you're not using the same player twice. So anybody expecting Cliff Ronning in 5 different places, I apologize, it's not going to happen. But yeah, Joe Sakic is my pick for the Colorado Avalanche. A ton of fun watching him play first in Quebec and then in Colorado. And since he's a BC boy, that definitely helps. For the New York Rangers, I went back and forth a bit on this one. But I'm going to go back to my childhood. My childhood and Ron Greshner before the New York Rangers won the Stanley Cup in 94. And Greshner was an excellent defenseman on a Rangers team that was pretty consistently good, not necessarily great. But Greshner gets my vote ahead of a few others. Brian Leetch, honorable mention, that kind of thing. But yeah, Ron Greshner would be my pick for the New York Rangers. So it's an older pick, sure, but again, would be my pick for the New York Rangers. For the New York Islanders, talk a lot about great goal scorers. Mike Bossy, absolutely one of the greatest, if not the greatest. And that's a whole debate we've had on this channel recently. Mike Bossy, really a consummate professional. Even though I did not like the New York Islanders when I started watching hockey, I didn't have a bad thing to say with Bossy then. Still don't now. And so, yeah, Mike Bossy gets my vote as my favorite member of the Islanders in their history. So, pretty simple, pretty basic. This video should not be that long. So I say that now, and then when I look at the end, I'm going to be like, oh, that ended up a lot longer than I thought it would. Florida. Roberto Luongo. So, honorable mention to Pavel Bure. Honorable mention to a bunch of players, including Sasha Barkov. But yeah, to me, Luongo would be the guy. And I loved Luongo's game before he went to Vancouver. I remember Luongo being an excellent goaltender for really bad Florida teams. And watching as he had a great save percentage, he was absolutely ridiculous behind a team that just couldn't win. And I felt bad for him. And then he went to Vancouver and he had a good run there. Ended up back in Florida before he retired. Now he's part of their management team, of course, and I have nothing but respect for Luongo, my favorite member of the Panthers. Montreal. Going back with this one, too. This may seem relatively cheap, but Guy Lafleur. And while I love Nick Suzuki's game, and I think Nick Suzuki has a really, really bright future, I'm going to go with Guy Lafleur for the Montreal Canadiens. I was around in the early 80s, mid 80s to watch his game. Things did fall apart for him relatively right around, I think it was 85, 86, where he ended up retiring. And then he came out of retirement later to play for New York and Quebec, which, again, didn't look great, as I said in the video where I talked about players that just didn't look right in certain jerseys. But yeah, Guy Lafleur is my pick for the Montreal Canadiens. For Columbus, of course, I talked about Columbus today. Well, Nick Foligno. Nick Foligno is my pick. When he didn't end up staying in Columbus and ended up leaving that team, to me it didn't feel right. I know that he's in Chicago. He's going into his second season. To me, he's still a Blue Jacket. And would I be surprised if at the time he retires, he does that whole signing for a day and retiring as a Blue Jacket? I wouldn't be overly surprised. Columbus hasn't had a lot of like really great players. Like I'm talking like that top upper echelon great player. They haven't had like a Guy Lafleur type in their history, but they've had some really good hard workers. And Nick Foligno to me qualifies in that category because his name's Foligno. You have to be a hard worker if you're a Foligno or you're out. For New Jersey, now I thought about Jamie Langenbrunner. I did, and I'm pretty sure that in the original video on the channel, he would have been my pick. But I'm going with Scott Niedermayer. Scott Niedermayer, excellent career for him. And one of the best defensemen I've ever watched play the game. I think the thing that stood out to me with Niedermayer, and I've said this when I've talked about him, it did feel like playing in New Jersey kept his offensive numbers down. And once he got to Anaheim, you saw that it did. His offensive numbers went through the roof in Anaheim. If he had played for a team that had more of an offensive role for him, I think his offensive totals would have been 30-40% above where he ended up. But he never complained, and it never bothered him because New Jersey was a winner. So as long as he was winning, I don't think he necessarily cared, and that's all Scott Niedermayer did in his career was win. For the LA Kings, going back with this one too. Marcel Dion. I again, this is one I kind of went back and forth on. There were a few. Adam Deadmarsh is one that I was a huge fan of for the Kings back in the day, but I'm going with Marcel Dion. Undersized forward is the best way to describe him by today's standards. But he worked hard. I always felt bad for him that, Gretzky gets there and things get better and he's out. He goes to the Rangers, ends up retiring as a Ranger. I never felt like that worked for me. But yeah, Marcel Dion, part of the Triple Crown line. Again, when I was coming into watching hockey, the Triple Crown line was a big deal. Charlie Simmer was one of my favorite players too. So yeah, I'm going to put Dion on the board and we'll move on to Seattle. For Seattle, this one was relatively easy because I have his jersey, so it would seem weird if I didn't put Jaden Schwartz. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing this Kings jersey, it's because I always get asked, like, what's your favorite jersey of all time? Yeah, the black version of this one. I'm wearing the white one so that I don't get the big difference in contrast between myself and the board, so the screen isn't adjusting for the huge difference between the board and myself. But yeah, Jaden Schwartz is my pick for Seattle. Good hard-working forward they picked up from St. Louis. And it'd be fun to see him win something in Seattle. So if Seattle won a Stanley Cup and Schwartz was there, I mean, hey, Seattle won a Stanley Cup. Let's be honest. Like, a lot of hockey fans would kind of melt down, but it'd still be entertaining. Toronto was not difficult. You know it's Mitch Marner. If you followed this channel long enough, you know it's Mitch Marner. Honorable mention to Matt Sundin. Honorable mention to a bunch of others, including Felix the Cat Potvin. But it's Mitch Marner. Marner is one of those players I look at and I say, you know what? Toronto may not win a Stanley Cup with Marner, But Marner, it feels like, is one of those guys who, if he moves on from Toronto and ends up somewhere else, he'll end up holding up the Stanley Cup. I think he's very talented. He's a very smart passer, good point producer, got a better shot than he gets credit for. And I think really what people take issue with more than anything is his cap hit, which, fair, but I think Marner's not underrated, but I think he's overly criticized. I'll put it that way. For Dallas, eventually it's going to be Logan Stankoven. Eventually. Or Rope Hintz. Somebody from this current team. But looking back, it's Mike Modano. I have a Modano jersey. It's a North Stars Modano that I have. And so I could have picked him for Minnesota, but I thought, no. I have somebody else from Minnesota. I'm going to put Modano up there for Dallas. Very good player. Shouldn't have retired in Detroit. Should have retired in Dallas. But either way, just great ambassador for the game. And just, yeah, I never had any problem with Modano. I've had issues sometimes with Ben's play in big games in the playoffs here and there, but I never had that problem with Modano. Minnesota. For Minnesota, I'm going with a current player here because, I mean, honestly, while Minnesota's had some really good star players, like Gaborik comes to mind, Kirill Kaprizov is remarkably talented to a point where I think he's the best, most talented forward the Minnesota Wild have ever had. He's an exciting player. He can take over games by himself and seems like a really nice all-around guy. Like and again, that is part of it. I usually will like players that just seem like, nice, decent people and all that. It is hard to, of course, measure that because hockey players are infamous for not giving you any information and just giving you very pat answers. But yeah, Kaprizov's a player I like a lot. So this Winnipeg is the original Winnipeg logo. And there's 2 Winnipeg entries because the original Winnipeg Jets, I felt like there was only one pick I could put on the board. Has to be Dale Hawerchuk. I do have a Hawerchuk jersey. And so, yeah, Dale Hawerchuk has to be the name on the board. Just there wasn't anybody else. Doug Smale gets an honorable mention because I know I've talked a lot about Doug Smale and how much I liked him in the 80s, which is true. But it's got to be Hawerchuk. For the Edmonton Oilers, this one may surprise people a little. What with Bill Ranford? Bill Ranford, a goaltender who had been good in Boston, ends up going to Edmonton and wins the Stanley Cup. And it was an unexpected Stanley Cup in 1990. Ranford had a pretty good career, and at a time where I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of the Oilers in general, I had a lot of respect for Ranford, still do. And looking over the Oilers' history and all of that, I'm going with Bill Ranford. I know there'll be people who are surprised it's not McDavid, but no, it's Ranford. San Jose. Joe Pavelski. I don't know that I truly appreciated Joe Pavelski till he landed in Dallas. And that's on me. And I fully apologize for that. Pavelski's goal scoring and his leadership and everything else that he's able to do, just, yeah, remarkable. So looking at San Jose's history, looking at their top players, to me, Pavelski's the guy that I pick as my favorite member of the San Jose Sharks that they've had. They've had a lot of players that I've liked over the years, but yeah, Pavelski ends up edging everybody else out. Anaheim. I have a bobblehead right here, which was gifted to me by the Anaheim Ducks of Paul Kariya. It's Paul Kariya. And Paul Kariya again, BC boy, absolutely. Very dynamic forward, played through injury. And yeah, Kariya gets my vote as my favorite member of the Ducks, which of course includes the Mighty Ducks. I guess I could have split the Anaheim Ducks. I could have said, oh, here's the Anaheim Ducks, here's the Mighty Ducks. But no, Paul Kariya gets my vote. Just always seemed like a great guy, and I've never seen anybody say anything bad about him. So there you go. For Vancouver, it's Cliffy. It's got to be Cliff Ronning. Cliff Ronning is my favorite player in the history of the game. And there he is on the board again. Ronning was undersized. He wasn't supposed to make it at the NHL level. I think that's part of the reason why the Blues traded him. Maybe that's part of the reason why the Canucks didn't think he was worth $1 million when he was set to go to market. And then he got a contract that paid him $1 million a year, meaning somebody thought he was worth $1 million a year. And wherever he played, he was just a really good player. But in Vancouver, the early 90s was a good time to be a Canuck fan after 15 years of absolute misery, where they didn't have a winning record for, I think it was 15 years. It was close to 15 years. I have a Hockey News issue which refers to them as the Doormat Dynasty. And I thought, yeah, that's accurate. And it talks about how the team hadn't had a winning season in over a decade. So Cliff Ronning came in as part of that big trade with St. Louis, and things turned around. Things turned around for the Canucks, and I thought Cliff Ronning was a steal, and he became one of my favorite players right away. If a player is diminutive in stature, they'll be one of my favorite players. For Vegas, yeah, that won't surprise anybody. William Karlsson, not a surprise. I have talked a lot about Wild Bill for years and how he's one of my favorite players in the league, much less in Vegas. I love his two-way game, and while he may not be as good now as he was, say, in 2018 offensively, he's still pretty good defensively, and I still like Karlsson. For Hartford wasn't a difficult one to decide on. And I thought, should I put up Jack Brownscheitel? Because nobody's going to know who Brownscheitel is. There may be some people watching this who are old like me who remember Jack Brownscheitel, but so I thought, no, go with Pat Verbeek. Pat Verbeek, Hartford Whaler, and he was very good. He was a goal scorer. He wasn't afraid to drop the gloves, and yeah, he played with some edge. So what wasn't there to like? Pat Verbeek gets on the board. Now for the current Winnipeg Jets, it's Kyle Connor. Kyle Connor has been one of my favorite players in the league for some time. Not a surprise for anybody. I got a Kyle Connor jersey from, I think it was from SVP Sports, because they're, offloading all the Adidas jerseys for cheap. And I was like, I'll take a Kyle Connor. Sure. I know I'll wear it. I've got two Kyle Connors now because, of course, I've got the blue alternate they had that nobody liked. Yeah, I've got one with Kyle Connor on the back of that. So I guess I'm a fan. I have two Kyle Connors jerseys, and yeah, I've liked his game for a long time. The Arizona Coyotes, who of course have relocated and all that fun stuff. For Arizona, it's on the board here, or it's on the paper here. Where did I put it? There it is. It's not in alphabetical order because I went back and forth like, well, do I qualify this as Utah? No, I have to qualify this as Arizona because Utah hasn't played a game yet. Which is where I came up with the idea of, when a team relocates, put a different player up. Nick Schmaltz for Arizona. Nick Schmaltz is the guy, and I liked him when he was in Chicago. I've liked him his whole time in Arizona. I think he's an underrated hockey player. I might be the only one that talks about Nick Schmaltz on the regular, so if that's the case, guilty as charged. Chicago. For Chicago, this is going back a ways. Honorable mention to Murray Bannerman's mask. Honorable mention as well to guys like Doug Wilson, Dirk Graham. But I'm going with Steve Larmer. Steve Larmer, hard worker, didn't miss a game. You got an honest effort every night from Steve Larmer. He was a pretty good scorer at points too. I think his scoring was kind of overlooked because his Iron Man streak became what people focused on a lot. But yeah, Larmer, pretty good offensive player as well. For Philadelphia, it's a current player. Sean Couturier. Sean Couturier is, of course, their captain currently, coming off of a rough year. I hope he has a nice bounce-back season. Couturier, I have felt for years, has been the most valuable player for Philadelphia when they're winning. When they've been winning over the last 5 years, very often Couturier is a big part of the reason why they're winning, and when they're not, Couturier sometimes is the one that's cold or injured. And over the last few years, definitely there's been a lot of time missed with injury. For Detroit was not a difficult one. And I apologize if Steve Yzerman seems like a lazy pick, but guy won a Stanley Cup on one leg. He could barely skate, and he won a Stanley Cup. And while I wasn't happy Detroit won a Stanley Cup that year, I had nothing but respect for Steve Yzerman and for the ability he had to play through pain. Something that, for Canuck fans that want me to pick Linden would point out the same thing from '94, but I'm still going with Ronning. Apologies. But yeah, Yzerman, really tough player, and as his career went along, his game became about the team. It wasn't about his stats or himself. It was about the team, and he kind of became the consummate leader. For the Carolina Hurricanes, don't get ahead of me, because I talk about Jacob Slavin a lot, how he's my favorite Carolina Hurricane, and so there he is on the board. He kind of has to be. I think the fact that he plays as well as he does defensively without taking penalties is nothing short of a miracle. You don't see that very often, and what that tells me too is when Slavin's playing career is done, he is going to be a coach. He's going to be a defensive coach in the NHL because he can tell these guys how to make these plays without ending up in the penalty box. And they're going to have to listen to him because his track record is phenomenal. When he gets a penalty, I'm surprised, and usually so's everybody else. For Tampa, another defenseman. Victor Hedman's been, I think, one of the best, if not the best, defenseman over the last roughly a decade in the NHL. And yeah, Hedman doesn't take a shift off, plays through injury, has 2 Stanley Cup rings now to his name. And again, I'm surprised he only has the 1 Norris Trophy because he's been so good for so long. Not that I think he's overly concerned with it. I think he's fine with the fact he's only got the 1. But yeah, so I'm going with Hedman. Now with Nashville, and it's interesting that and it's random, it is. But right next to Hedman here, or right below Hedman, is Roman Josi for Nashville. Josi's a player that I appreciated more when I started watching all the games. So when the channel started out, I wasn't watching all the games. That started in 2018. And I really started to like his game more. A lot of the players you'll see on the board are the kinds of guys that the more you see them, the more you like them, the more you like their game. And that's been the case with Josi. I realized just how good he was all around. He was overshadowed a bit by other players on that blue line in his earlier years, but he's really emerged as one of the best defensemen in the National Hockey League and very nearly got that Norris. I know that it was a runaway win by Quinn Hughes, but if Josi had a first half like he had the second half, voting would have been a little bit tighter. Washington. Some are going to know this name. If you're around my age, you'll know Kelly Miller. The Miller family, work ethic has been a staple. Kelly Miller, Kip Miller, Ryan Miller. There's been a good work ethic throughout. Drew Miller too. Sure, why not? I'll throw in Drew Miller. But Kelly Miller was my favorite member of the Capitals at times. And yeah, I've got Kelly Miller up there. Been some pretty good ones though. Bob Gould would have been on the board if his career had been more in the time that I was watching, and if I'd seen more of him, I think Gould might have been up there. Also honorable mention to Kevin Hatcher and Olaf Kolzig and a bunch from the 80s. Because in the 80s, the Caps were right up there. Again, I wasn't told you weren't allowed to cheer for multiple teams when I was a kid. So that's where it started, and then it just never stopped. Once you've experienced life cheering for more than one NHL team, you just can't go back. I apologize. For St. Louis, this might be obscure to some, which I think is too bad. Scott Young was a good producer, and not only that, Scott Young got better, I thought, as he got older. He was again, the points were there, the work ethic was there. I liked the player. There is that propensity I have to cheer for and root for and favor players who maybe aren't the star player on the team. So Scott Young may be a bit of a surprise pick from me, but if you go look at his resume, he played for a while. He was pretty darn good. And Scott Young gets my vote for St. Louis. For the Minnesota North Stars, I almost put Neil Broughton. I almost did. So I guess he gets an honorable mention. Joe Meloche will get an honorable mention, but it has to be Craig Hartsburg. Has to be. Again, early to mid-'80s, this guy, Huge fan of Craig Hartsburg, one of my favorite players in the league. Can I explain it? Kind of. I thought he was a really good defenseman, and I really enjoyed his game. And yeah, I know I did a career video on him. I know I put him in the THG Hall of Fame. So yeah, you know what's interesting is I'm just thinking this now, like how many of these guys are actually in my Hall of Fame, and then the ones that aren't, do I feel bad? Probably, yeah. So for Calgary, this goes way back too, and I know this guy's in my Hall of Fame. Paul Reinhart. Paul Reinhart played through injury, played really, really well through injury. When he was on the ice, you couldn't tell that he was in any kind of pain or anything. But Paul Reinhart, again, the work ethic, yep, absolutely. And I'm guaranteeing that he's very, very proud of Sam Reinhart and what he's been able to do. I was always kind of disappointed that Griffin Reinhart didn't pan out at the NHL level, because I had thought, it'd be great. Paul Reinhart, who was my favorite defenseman, if his son came in and became one of my favorite defensemen in the league, and it just never, he was never quite able to break through. For Buffalo, I think the further I get away from Dominik Hasek's NHL career, the more I appreciate it. Again, sometimes that's what it is. With time, you look back and you realize, you know what? That was a ridiculous effort, a ridiculous season, or in the case of Hasek, just a ridiculous career. He was so acrobatic. I don't think you can teach his goaltending style to anybody. I don't even know if he could teach it to other goaltenders. But yeah, Hasek I don't know how he made saves, but he did. He was remarkable to watch. He dragged Buffalo teams that at times were kind of mediocre to much better records than they should have had. And he was easily the best goaltender in the league for that stretch with the Buffalo Sabres. Now, Atlanta Thrashers, and I do have a pick for the Atlanta Thrashers. And it's not Kovalchuk, it's Slava Kozlov. So players that age well, and as they're in their mid-30s, maybe they're playing their best hockey. Slava Kozlov was one of those. He broke into the league with Detroit, was good, more of a support player. In Atlanta, he was just remarkable. On an Atlanta team that was not remarkable, he was. And so Slava Kozlov is my pick for the Arizona Coyotes. And finally, the Quebec Nordiques. Peter Puck. No, not Peter Puck, Peter Stastny. Peter Stastny, the story of how the Stastnys come over, how they defected and came over to North America, it's a harrowing tale. It's one of the reasons why, too, for Buffalo, I considered McGillney, because the story of how McGillney defected and came over to North America is fantastic, too. I would highly recommend that for people who haven't watched specials on the Stastnys. I know there's been videos on McGillney's defection as well. It really was taking your safety and perhaps the family, your family's safety, and kind of throwing that all up in the air for the sake of pursuing your dream in North America. So Stastny, who had an amazing career, very talented, and I was almost going to put up here just Stastny, because Peter, Anton, Marion, I thought all three of them were really good. I was so excited when Marion came over. I was like, oh, we got 3 Stastnys. It never quite worked out in the playoffs for the Nordiques, but they had a good solid run in the mid-'80s. And yeah, Peter Stastny was one of the most talented players I watched. So there you go. My favorite player from every franchise. And it's a lot. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event that you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.